Hi, I'm Phil Cooke, and welcome to this episode of the Phil Cooke Podcast. You know, recently I was invited to be a guest on the 700 Club in Virginia Beach, Virginia, to talk about my new book, Church on Trial: How to Protect Your Congregation, Mission, and Reputation During a Crisis. It's been a really interesting time since I released the book, because I've had pastors who bought boxes of the book to give to every member of their elders, all their elders, their staff people, because they felt like it's such an important manual when a church goes through a crisis. And boy, if you've read the headlines lately, you know that it's not letting up. There's so many things, and it's not just failure on the part of a pastor or a staff member. It's also external issues. It may be a cancel culture protest. It may be a criticism from a local person on a blog or Facebook page. It could be any number of things. It could be a lawsuit from a family whose kid broke his leg in the playground. We've seen a lot of cases recently of embezzlement in churches. In fact, I saw a study recently that embezzlement in churches adds up to more than $1 billion a year. I mean, think for a second of what we could do for the kingdom of God with that $1 billion a year that's simply stolen by church staff members. So it's a complex issue. And I poured all of that into my book, Church on Trial, because I've spent really decades helping churches navigate some really, really challenging and difficult crisis situations. And so I was invited to be on 700 Club. Gordon Robertson's an old friend and love that team up there. And they invited me to talk. And I was interviewed by their co-host, Ashley Key. And she did a great job. And I just want to share that with you. I think many of the issues we talked about are really very important. And I think it's worth you listening because their questions were good. And I think it's important that we understand how to respond. Remember, it's not about covering anything up. It's not about trying to lie or protect somebody. It's about getting the truth out there. And in today's digital social media world where wrong information is everywhere, it's more important than ever that we understand how to get the truth of a story out there to help resolve it, help get to the other side of the crisis or the controversy, and help the church or ministry organization emerge on the other side. So here's my interview with Ashley. I think you're going to enjoy it.
Well, shocking scandals, sudden emergencies. Church leaders face all sorts of unpredictable challenges. Phil Cooke says they need to know how to respond to these crises because sooner or later they will happen.
Author and CEO Phil Cooke says in today's digital culture, the opportunities for crises in a church or organization is amplified. Knowing how to respond quickly and appropriately is critical.
I believe it's not if a crisis will happen, it's when a crisis will happen.
In his latest book, Church on Trial, Phil gives you the tools to manage the unexpected so you can help your church or organization survive and move forward.
Well, please welcome to the 700 Club, Phil Cooke. Phil, thank you so much for being
here with us today. Thank you, Ashley. Appreciate it.
This is so needed. How to protect your congregation, mission, and reputation during a crisis. This is important that we talk about because you've mentioned this in one of your videos. It says 27% of people leave not just the church,
right,
but the faith entirely. They walk away from Christianity because of how a church or a congregation might respond or not respond to a crisis.
Or because the church handled it badly.
Right. So, I mean, okay, when we think of a church crisis, sadly, the first thing that comes to so many of our minds is a pastor, a lead pastor, having a moral failure, like an affair or something. If that were to happen in your local church, what should they do?
Well, the sexual abuse, the sexual issues, they get the headlines more than anything else, although there's a wide range of crisis problems that happen to churches. But I'm a big advocate of being very clear. I'm not an attorney. I'm not a counselor. In the book, I talk about you need a good attorney. You need to provide counseling for a victim if there is one. Sometimes we forget about the victim, and we don't really prioritize the victim as much as we should. But I'm a big believer that communicating your message during a crisis is absolutely critical. How you communicate it, what you say, when you say it, can be the difference between crashing and burning or getting to the other side successfully.
Well, how can a church, is it even possible to prevent a crisis like this?
Absolutely. I think, and you know, the first third of my book, I talk about building a culture where you can avoid a crisis. I mean, you can't fully avoid a crisis, but it can sure protect you against it. And I'm a big advocate of transparency, not just personal transparency and finances and your relationships and in your calendar and your email and those things, but also even physical transparency. I'm an advocate of let's put windows and glass doors in church offices. Anything we can do that might help stop an inappropriate relationship from starting could save a life, it could save a church, it could save a marriage. It's really critical.
Now, how should pastors be held accountable by their elders and their deacons? Because they should be, but
Absolutely.
I think sometimes that's forgotten. Like, there's so much trust put into the pastor, which I think is necessary, but they have to be held accountable by the other members of the church. How can that happen?
And that trust is undermined if they're not held accountable. That's so very important. And I think, you know, if you've decided in your heart you're going to cover something up or sin and keep it quiet, there's not much people can do. And I think you have to intentionally decide, I'm going to be open with the elders. They're going to be open with me. And again, that transparent kind of culture makes a huge difference out there. So I think that it's very important that you have an accountable, transparent culture in the church. And I think you can't underestimate the importance to the congregation. You know, very often we forget about the victim, but we also forget that the congregation is also a victim in many of these cases. They've supported the church, they've given, they've volunteered, they've been a vital part of it, and we need to really take care of them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think what's so interesting about this is you actually have some sort of a personal experience. I wanted to talk about your father.
Yeah.
He was a part of a situation he did not initiate. It wasn't necessarily his fault, but he didn't respond to it. Or if he did, it was too late. Can you just talk about
I'm a big advocate
happened?
of responding quickly. My dad was a pastor, and in the late, it was at a Presbyterian church. In the late 60s, when the charismatic renewal happened, he started preaching on the Holy Spirit. And the church started growing, but we had one elder that didn't like it. And my dad knew it, but he didn't think it was a big deal. He didn't worry about it. But within a year, that elder had worked behind the scenes and it ended up getting my dad fired. My first call from my parents from college was, hey, we've just been fired from the church that you grew up in. And it was really devastating. But my dad went on and started other churches and did really well. But looking back, I've often thought, had he taken that seriously early on, and again, like you say, it wasn't his fault. It wasn't a scandal with him. It was just an elder that wanted him out of there. I think had he taken it seriously early on, he could have really taken a different direction and made a difference. So whatever type of scandal or crisis happens at a church, the moment to act is now.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you talk about internal scandals and how they're only like half of the type of a crisis that a church goes through. There's also external, outside crises. So what are some of like the examples of an outside crisis?
I often say that any church doing an amazing job in their community and a really effective church has some critic on the outside, either a disgruntled ex-church member or ex-employee or just somebody from the community that doesn't like church that are criticizing them online. It could be a protest. It could be a city. There's zoning issues. There's a lot of ways that an outside crisis can happen. And they're very important. I think the inside crises that you mentioned are often self-inflicted. It's from having a sexual relationship with someone. It's from embezzlement. One study indicates 3 out of 7 pastors have admitted of some kind of a financial embezzlement in their church over the years. And it adds up to billions of dollars. So both outside and inside crises happen, and they can really have a devastating impact on a church or a ministry.
Why do you think, it's just so interesting, over the past several years, there have been headline after headline after headline of pastors who have had these moral failings. Do you think it's a pastoral problem? Do you think it's a church problem? What do you think the issue is?
Well, I think there's a lot of things happening. We're all fallen creatures. We're all fallen human beings, and people sin. They make mistakes. However, on the other side, pastors and church leaders, they don't teach this stuff in college or Bible study, Bible college or seminary. If you respond badly, it just makes things worse. And so that's a big part of my book, is to be a reference so church leaders, elders, senior leaders, pastors can have a real guide to how we practically can respond to the crisis to help make things work out in a positive way.
Well, what are some of the things that you talk about that churches or ministries should not do in a crisis?
Yeah, one of the things in the heat of a crisis, don't spend a lot of time worrying about why it happened. Sometimes I'll go into a church situation where they're having a crisis and all they want to talk about is, how did this happen? Look, let's solve the problem right now. Let's get in deep. Let's solve it. Let's get over it. Then we'll have plenty of time to talk about why it happened. But let's solve the problem now. Take care of the victim, prioritize the right things, communicate well. Then we can worry about that. So I always tell churches, don't spend so much time worrying early on about why it happened. Let's solve the problem, then we'll talk about that.
Well, I think a lot of the tendency can be for churches to avoid. Just ignore it.
Yes.
Let's hope it goes away. What would you say to people who have that kind of take on it?
It doesn't help. Trying to cover something up, trying to ignore it will always come back and hurt you in the end. It's just, I'm a big advocate of be honest up front, tell the truth, and you may not know the whole story, but as much as you know, tell the truth from the very beginning. That's a critical way to handle a crisis.
Well, you also talk about in the book how the digital world has just changed so much, especially when it comes to churches and ministries dealing with a crisis. Talk more about that.
Well, with social media, there's so many more opportunities now to say something inappropriate, do something inappropriate, a staff member, church member. Oh my gosh, it's opened the door to so much mischief out there that we have to be on guard. I encourage pastors to meet with their teams and talk about these kind of things. Let's get up front with this and talk about how critical this is. I found a church recently that had a youth director that was talking about the old days getting drunk during spring break down in Florida. And I thought, okay, people know he's the youth leader of this church. Maybe we shouldn't talk about that on social media so much. So there's so many things like that it's worth sitting down with your team and really talking about what's appropriate and what's not.
Last question, how can churches rebuild trust after a crisis?
Well, it's very important not just to communicate the truth of what happened. It's also important to communicate what we've done to fix this so it won't happen again. Maybe it's a youth director problem. Then let's make sure parents understand it's safe to send their kids here because we fixed this problem and we put principles and procedures in place so it doesn't happen again. I'll tell you, building trust, rebuilding trust is really the key.
Yeah. Phil, thank you so much for your book. It's timely, like the global church needs this. So thank you so much. All right, everyone. Well, you can discover more about how to protect your congregation by getting Phil's latest book. It's called Church on Trial, and it's available nationwide.
Well, I really enjoyed my time at CBN, and Ashley was terrific, and they were just great hosts. And I just want to remind you that Church on Trial, how to protect your congregation, mission, and reputation during a crisis. It's available through our website. In fact, you can go to philcooke.com and find out how to order bulk copies. We can get you a discount on bulk copies. I mean, as I said at the beginning, a lot of pastors and ministry leaders are buying boxes of these things to help give them to staff members and elders and really board members. Because I'll tell you, we need this information about how to navigate through a crisis. It's so very, very important. So go to my blog at philcooke.com. You can find out about the book, find out about other stuff. If you haven't subscribed to my weekly newsletter, it's really the top 5 stories that I write on my blog every week. You really should. It will encourage you. It comes out during the week and it's free. There's no charge, but it'll encourage you because I write about the stuff you're involved in every day. So check it out. I'd love to see you, and I'll see you at the next episode.